definitely appreciate being an opportunity to talk in front of you. I'm Ian. I run solution architecture at Andromeda Security. I have been in the security space for about 15 years. I started my career as a software engineer and have done many different things from go-to-market to product, but I'm very happy to be talking to you today. And I bring that up because it may be relevant in different parts of this conversation. But one of the things that I'm hearing here is a lot of kind of very similar content. So you'll see some things, some repeated stats in my presentation that you've already heard before. And I think that confirms at least one thing, that we all recognize that there's a problem, and we all recognize, kind of the extent of that problem. And everybody has like slightly different solutions to how to solve that. And I think we can all work together to have an even better like overall solution to what that problem is. But first things first, like when I joined Andromeda, I think, I had heard for a long time, identity is the new perimeter. And I recognize what that means, but I didn't really understand it until I joined here. And man, like identity really is how we govern access to basically everything in any environment today. The traditional perimeter doesn't really mean anything anymore. And the one thing that is changing more recently, though, is kind of the adoption of NHAIs. We've heard a lot about kind of the explosion of NHAIs, and we have NHAIs for service accounts and APIs, and we have NHAIs for cloud workloads, and now we have NHAIs that are agentic identities that are doing even more and kind of operating in a different fashion than we've seen before. The idea here is that we want to find the humanity in non-human and agentic identities. What does that mean? It means we're looking to extend kind of human governance models to cover agentic identity or agentic and non-human identities as well. And we'll talk about like kind of what the scope of that looks like and why it's important in your organization as part of this presentation. And I'll just say one more thing. I'm going to try not to, but if you see me kind of like scratch my leg a little bit, I had an unfortunate incident with some poison ivy recently. So I'll try not to do it, but give me some grace there. Okay, we've seen some of these stats before. Actually, our friends from Intro shared this 144:1 ratio of non-humans to humans. And I think it was also in Francis's presentation as well. So the good news is we're all using kind of the same stats here. But 144:1 is a pretty amazing ratio. And we talk about the ratio of non-human to human identities and talk about like what that means in terms of workforce. It ultimately means that non-humans are by far the larger part of your workforce than humans are. And on top of that, Forrester says, that number is going to grow 40% year over year. So not only is it the largest part of your workforce, it's also the fastest growing part of your workforce by far. And the challenges that presents to us is that we have governance models, but those governance models were designed to identify accountability, oversight, and intent for humans. And we're trying to extend that to NHIs, but it's sort of an afterthought. And it's kind of a strange concept that the largest part of your workplace is going to be governed as an afterthought. And so we're hoping to kind of change that thought process. So, what are some of the challenges that we have? And there's a couple of different types of NHIs. We've heard a lot about agentic identities, but there's also kind of your traditional NHIs and what kind of problems are, organizations face. And I mentioned that my experience as a software engineer might be relevant, and it's definitely relevant in this example here. We have this concept of kind of the orphaned worker. So have, in this case, an admin creates an integration. He calls it prod integration SA. So prod integration service account for purpose X, and that's going to integrate with product B. And then, admin A, he doesn't document what that's for. He just creates it. And maybe he creates it with little extra credentials. I know I've done this before. I'm kind of ashamed to admit it, but I definitely have. Like I couldn't get an integration to work. And I said, okay, well, what if I throw an extra role on it? Now it works. Okay, great. But probably not the best practice in the world. But then, admin A says, okay, I know what this is for. I'll keep track of it. And then he leaves the organization or she leaves the organization. Then admin B comes over and says, I kind of remember what this is for. And then admin C comes and I have no idea what it's for. And the admin C sees it and says, this thing's called prod integration SA. I don't know what it's for. I don't know if anyone's using it, but that sounds pretty scary. Like I don't want to delete that. I don't want to mess with it. It's going to mess with prod. It's going to mess with our prod environment. Part of the reasons that we have this explosion of NHIs is to accommodate things like integrations, accommodate automation, to accommodate efficiency in the organization. And if I turn this thing off and it breaks something and we start losing money, I'm going to be in trouble. So instead, I'll just leave it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. But the problem there is that the integration was created to integrate with product B. We don't even have product B anymore. It doesn't exist. We've decommissioned that in the environment. And so now we have an unowned orphan NHI that exists in the environment, and it's adding risk. It's adding to our threat landscape or to our footprint in the environment for no reason. providing no value in the company, all because we just didn't know what to do with it. And so I have kind of two garages in here. The first garage is kind of like your dad's garage, or I'm a dad, kind of like my garage gets every once in a while. I got IKEA furniture, or I've got kids' stuff that I had to put together, or I get weird pieces of wood that, I cut and I can't get myself to throw away because it might be useful someday. I don't know. That weird little strap that you're supposed to connect to the wall for earthquake safety. I live in California. We probably should connect the dresser to the wall. Don't want to do that. I've never done that. I have probably 50 of those straps at home, but keep them because they might be useful someday. I don't know. I don't know what they're for. But occasionally my wife, a few times a year, she yells at me and she says, hey, garage is looking pretty gross. And then I don't know, like I have a hard time seeing that when I'm in it, but then, like somebody points it out and you're like, oh yeah, it does look pretty gross. And so we do some spring cleaning, we clean it up and it looks better and we keep some of the stuff, but a lot of the stuff I throw away. I didn't really need that weird piece of wood. And if I need one, I'll go buy a new one. But the point is, that's a lot like the environment that customers have. It's a lot like what they're facing or with like people, enterprises have, right? Is they have this kind of collection of NHAIs and service accounts and things in the environment that they don't know what it's for. They don't know why it's doing what it's doing. They don't know if it's got more permissions than it needs because somebody just added those permissions because that's what they needed to do to get it to work. You need some kind of spring cleaning. You need some way to kind of regularly review that and get rid of what you don't need and keep some of the stuff that you maybe might need, but most of the stuff is the stuff that you absolutely need. And the good news is that we kind of already have a process for this. It's in user access reviews. User access reviews are something we do for human identities all the time. And it's a spring cleaning process for the garage. We go in and we say, what access does this user have? What's the purpose of them having this access? And do they still need this access? And do they need this level of access? Is this still a requirement for them? That same process can very much be applied to NHIs. Slight difference in that we want to identify who the owner is. So who's the owner of the NHI? So who's responsible for it? Who's responsible for kind of reviewing it and regularly verify that owner so that when admin A leaves and admin B leaves and admin C is now responsible for it. Admin C knows what the NHI is and knows that they're responsible for either decommissioning it or changing the roles or changing the privileges or reviewing the rights that it has. And the purpose. So what's the purpose of the NHI? We need to know why that NHI exists. Why did somebody create it? And then the access. So the access that the NHI has, is it still valid? Is the app that it's connecting to still valid? Is the integration still valid? Is the ability to create infrastructure really needed? Or is it just needing to read the list of instances that exist in the environment? Lots of different things that need to be taken into consideration. But we have a UAR process, extending that process to machines. It's a very easy way to start getting to that kind of cleaner garage that we're talking about here. Now, the next thing, though, is this agentic identities. And this throws a little bit of a wrench into things. When we look at NHIs and we compare that to agentic identities, NHIs are pretty easy to model behavior. They have kind of a static logic pattern. We said, okay, this is what this NHI is supposed to do. It's supposed to run this process on this schedule or when this event is triggered. It's not really going to change its behavior pattern. Maybe there's some branching conditionals in there that will cause that pattern to change. But ultimately, it's going to do what it does, and that's about it. If it's overprivileged, it's okay. I mean, it's not good. And if it's overprivileged, it's not going to necessarily use those additional privileges. The risk there is in credentials leaking. So if my NHI's credentials are compromised and it has more privileges than it needs, then we can get to things like lateral movement. We can get to things where we have real security problems in the environment. Agents are different, though. Agents represent a whole different type of concern. So agents don't have a standard operating procedure. They have a prompt that they need to follow, and they have some guidelines, but they're reasoning based. So they're not going to just do the same thing every time. They're also goal oriented. So they're going to do everything they need to kind of achieve the goal that they're trying to get to. The problems that exist are not just that the credentials could be compromised and that agents, roles and responsibilities could be used for other purposes, but the agent itself, if it's overprivileged, could do things that are malicious without intending it to be malicious. So a good example of that, I think everybody maybe is familiar with this example, but Chevy of Watsonville, they said, hey, you know what would be great? If at a car dealership, I could implement a ChatGPT agent and have it talk to my prospective customers. My customers can ask questions. And wouldn't that be nice? We could maybe have less people. We could be more friendly. But somebody said, hey, you know what? I'm going to negotiate a price with this agent. And they did. And they negotiated the price down to $1. And then they said, is this a legally binding offer? And the agent said, yeah, absolutely. It's a legally binding offer. Why not? The dealer refused. And we can all laugh about that. But, this is a problem of kind of overprivileged, agent. Agents shouldn't have had the authority to set the price. It definitely shouldn't have the authority to make a legally binding offer. This is a funny kind of scenario. We can laugh and say, haha, isn't that funny that it was a $1 car? But imagine an agent that had the authority to spin up architecture or to access credentials or to distribute credentials. Then you could have a much more catastrophic result. So, how do you solve that problem? Well, you can solve that problem by one way to do it is to think about like user entitlements. You could say, okay, well, I know how I'm going to make this. This agent is going to act on behalf of my user. And so I'm going to build the agent's access based on what a user has. Doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? 95% of identities are overprivileged. So the problem starts with your human identities in the first place. And the difference is a human identity is overprivileged, but human identities have like a throttle. They have a limiter built into them. They're not going to take advantage of the extra privileges they have because A, they might not know, and B, they know they might get in trouble if they go and make a legally binding offer, but they don't have the authority to do that. Or they set a price to $1. They have some kind of extra capabilities. Agents don't. They exhaust every privilege that they have. They use everything they have at their disposal to achieve the goal that they've been set out to do. And that creates a massive risk in just saying, hey, we're going to give agents human entitlements without actually reviewing what's in place. So how do we fix that? We can fix that a couple of different ways. One is we start with human behavior and we say, how do we implement least privileges with humans? And one of the biggest challenges is we can look at the entitlements that a human has, and we can say, it doesn't look like someone in finance should have access to read this data in S3. And maybe there's a reason for it. Maybe they do need it. But what helps in kind of identifying that is not just looking at the role and what access they have, but actually looking at what they're using. So how can we take the activity data, look at what the human is actually doing in their environment, and correlate that to the actual roles and permissions that are being used? And if you can do that, you can build models. And you can build models of normal human behavior, easily implement least privileges. And if you can do that, then you have models that you can build your agent entitlements off of. And then we can start doing things like regular and consistent reviews of access to make sure that, over time, just like with the humans, we are, reviewing and making sure that the access that they have is the correct amount of access, the access that they have is still necessary, and that the identity itself is even required. At Andromeda, we believe strongly that, a lot of this work starts with data. So we have data coming from your IDP, your HR solution, your cloud providers, your agent platforms, applications, and ISPMs or ITSM solutions. And the challenge is that a lot of places also agree with us, but they're stop at just identity inventory and roles and groups, but they're not looking at the actual activity. And activity is the context that we can use to help build those human behavioral models. It's activity that we can use to actually action on least privileges. And it's also context that we can use to make things that have been traditionally very difficult and cumbersome, like user access reviews, like JIT, much easier processes. Because if you can say, hey, you know what, I'm going to do a user access review, or I'm going to do an NHAI-based user access review, or I'm going to do a review of human ownership on an NHAI before I even look at the access the NHAI has, and I can provide context about whether that user is actually using the privileges or whether that NHI is actually using the privileges that it's been granted, then you can make much quicker decisions. You make smarter decisions. You can make that process much less painful. And so that's kind of our core philosophy in building our kind of graph-based data lake and correlating that information. And I know I've got maybe 1 minute left, so there we go. So kind of the key here is when we talk about finding the humanity in NHIs, there's a few things that I want you to think about and a few things that Andromeda is helping solve. And one of those is establishing human ownership. So how can we understand who the humans are that own those NHIs? So Andromeda is building an inference model to kind of identify who we think the owner is. Then an ability for us to attest that ownership, to regularly say and can keep up to date, is that NHI or is that owner the human, the owner of that NHI, so that we have a responsibility model that we can keep up to date. The next thing is let's base the entitlements off of real usage. So for both NHIs and for agentic identities, let's take a look at the roles and privileges that have been provided and evaluate whether they're actually needed or whether they're actually used. And just like with humans, do user access reviews or do NHAI access reviews to validate that and provide the context to the reviewers so that they can make quick decisions and make those smartly. And, like I said, lastly is just make sure you review the intent too. So does the product still exist? Does a reason for this NHAI exist in this environment? Does a reason for this agent exist in this environment? And so, we're trying to build a cohesive platform that ties humans, ties NHIs, ties agentic identities together, and uses all of that to give you the context that you need to be safely deploy these things in your environment and safely do it at scale. And so I think that was right on time. Maybe I'm a minute over here, but come talk to us. We're here. And we'd love to tell you more about what we're doing and how we might be able to help you guys.